Good evening. I call a special meeting of the Ames City Council for Tuesday, April 18th to order. And we have two items on the agenda. The first is consent. Does council wish to pull the single item from consent? Otherwise, I'd entertain a motion on resolution.
Move approval of the consent item.
Second.
Thank you. Roll call.
Aye.
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 Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. Second item is discussion on climate action plan document. I'm going to turn it over to our team. And after thinking about it, I think it may be best if you could just go through the slideshow without asking or council asking questions. Then we can circle back and then just go through it. That way we can get through all the slides and maybe some of the questions are answered as part of the PowerPoint presentation.
All right, very good. Well, good evening, Mayor and Council. Thank you for spending this evening with us to go through the Climate Action Plan document. This is our first look at what a draft of the plan will look like. And since we met, our last meeting was in November, so the new portion and the portion that we're going to spend a bulk of the time on this evening is on the implementation plan, because that's not something you had seen prior to this evening. So we'll be spending time on that and of course, in addressing any questions or comments you have about the entire document. So with me up front here is our project team with Susan, Mary, and Don. We do have individuals in the audience from the Supplemental Input Committee, so I want to welcome them as well as any other public members. And then with us from SSG, are Eric and Naomi was on there. We don't see her on the screen, but she was on a little bit earlier, and they're going to walk through the presentation. So at this point in time, I'm going to turn it over to Eric. And Eric, did you hear the mayor's comments about going through the slides and then questions will come thereafter? Yes. Okay. Well, there's Naomi.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Naomi's there?
Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Okay. I'll turn it over to SSG.
Okay, thank you. Hopefully I hear now, maybe now that I'm speaking.
Yep.
We see. Hello, everyone. I'm Naomi Devine with SSG, and we have my colleague, as mentioned, Eric Burnett as well. We're really pleased to be here again with you today for this City Steering Committee meeting. And thank you very much also to the mayor. We thought best to go through the entire presentation too, and then take questions because we want you to get the full picture and the whole story. As well, some questions might be answered, but please note the ones that you have as they arise because we don't want to miss anything either. Make sure that we answer them all for you. So for the agenda that we're proposing is a recap of the greenhouse gas emissions reduction target, a recap of the 6 big moves, or 6 big climate moves is another way to think of them. The impact of the IRA, the Inflationary Reduction Act, action financials, implementation strategy, and then time for questions and discussion. Let's go to the next slide. So just a project overview. We've done a lot in the last 2 years together, so it's good to take a moment and take stock of the journey, essentially that we've been on. At the beginning, we promised that climate action planning would be iterative, meaning that we would stop along at each stage, of course, and seek feedback and discussion and incorporate those perspectives into the planning process. And certainly a lot of work has gone into, a lot of work has gone into incorporating all of that feedback along the way, making this a very robust draft that does reflect the reality in Ames, Iowa, with respect to climate action planning. So we started in the beginning with pre-engagement and take a look at the BAU, or what we call the business as usual emissions projection. Like, what would the future look like if no action was taken? We had a really great discussion on target setting as well, and with council, too, and sort of began the low carbon action development from there. And we've had lots of discussions with the SIC and with council and other stakeholders in the community, as well to hear about target setting, hear about the low carbon action planning, and the assumptions that went into making that scenario a reality. And then we took a look at the financials as well, and certainly a recap a bit of our last sort of time together was taking a look at the low carbon results and staff recommendations and all the good work that staff had also put into and really dug into this sort of component of the plan. And we also, after that, had an SIC meeting about implementation, as well, in terms of hearing their feedback as well, in terms of what they thought about what that looked like. And so we've drafted the climate action plan, and we've worked on implementation planning too, of course, to take the work and the feedback that we received from staff and from council and the SIC into the implementation plan. So we're here to take a look at that tonight and the draft climate action plan and the entire package. So we're just about near the end of our time together. Eric, anything I missed that you would add?
It's been a long and interesting journey, and it's pretty exciting to be here towards the end of this. So very excited for the discussion tonight.
Yeah, wonderful. And we thought we'd bring back an old friend on the next slide. Just as a recap too, what is climate action planning, itself, and the distinction between the plan and of course the implementation guide. And really, it's setting the target that sets the speed and taking a look at the modeling, and the size of the challenge. And then in order to land this is the implementation strategy and all the things that sort of go into that. And certainly some exciting things have happened in our time together in that 2-year time frame. One of the things I'd like to highlight, as you've seen this before, but it's new, is there's been across the United States a 10% adoption of EVs or electric vehicles, which is sort of widely regarded as a bit of a tipping point. And there's been other sort of significant changes in the landscape as well. So it's been great to be able to work on both the climate action plan and the implementation strategy with you all during this exciting time. And let's go to the next slide. And over to Eric to talk about the reminder of the low carbon pathway that was selected.
Thanks, Naomi. So a little bit of recap to start us off, because last time we met was in November, so it's been a few months since then. So here is the target that we set together. It's an ambitious target. It's 83% reduction of base year emissions by 2030, and then net zero by 2050. So this was the target that we set. And then if we look at, we've seen this before, but as a recap, if we look at the modeling results and where we ended up at 70% reduction by 2030, so not as far as the target we set. And the main reason for that is, there's a few reasons, but the main reason for that is the transportation sector. Basically, the stock of gas and diesel vehicles takes a while to turn over and change into EV vehicles, and that takes some time. So in the modeling, we stopped short at that point. Would be to start early retirement of vehicles. Very forceful and ambitious kind of thing to do. We stopped before getting to that point. So that's why we get to 70% reduction by 2030 in the modeling, and not the 83 that we had in the target. And we get to 94% reduction by 2050, not net zero, due to the electricity, the grid electricity still having some emissions associated with its production, and waste, still a little bit of waste emissions. So by 2030, we're at 4.8 tons of GHG emissions per capita, all the way down to 0.8 tons of GHG emissions per capita by 2050. And here we have our 6 big moves. So number 1 was renewable energy generation. Then we have building retrofits program. Number 3 is net zero new construction. Then we have reducing vehicle emissions, and then increasing active transportation and transit use, and finally reducing waste emissions. So we had around 30 modeled actions, and we grouped them into these bigger groups to make things a little bit simpler and group together. And these represent all the actions and moves that was modeled in order to reach the results that we just saw. And this graph here, this is the wedge diagram. So we've seen this before. And basically the idea of this diagram is you have GHG emissions is the y-axis in kilotons, and we have the years, so across time. Each one of these represents a modeled action. We don't have that detailed modeled action list here. We're just looking at it at a higher level by a big group of big moves. But each one of these different colors does represent a modeled action and the amount of emissions reductions impact it has over time. And the main thing to look at here is our big moves, and look at those 6 big moves and see what the cumulative impact of those big moves are over time on emissions reductions. So the biggest impact one in our big moves is renewable energy generation. So we've seen this result before, and it was also part of the staff report as one of the main staff recommendations for what to do as next steps is to look at actions in this category, renewable energy generation. And then we have building retrofits program and net zero new construction as being the next two biggest emission reducing big moves, followed by the vehicle emissions, active transportation, and reducing waste emissions. So with all those actions and that pathway to get us to close to net zero by 2050, there's a cost associated with that, which we've seen together. We've costed each one of the 30 or so different actions. This is a summary view of those financials over time. So very high level summary of what the financials are in the model. The blue here represents capital expenditures. So these are things like buying EVs, buying heat pumps, retrofitting buildings, any type of capital expenditure you could have. And you'll see that a lot of this is concentrated in the beginning of our timeline. And then what's next in purple and yellow is energy cost savings. So a reduction in utility bills for households, for example, and O&M savings. So something like electric vehicles tend to have lower operation and maintenance costs than combustion engine vehicles. So that would give you savings. And what you'll notice, and that's one of the key things for financials in this type of roadmap, is you'll have these very big capital expenditures at the beginning, and then you'll have your savings from energy costs and O&M kind of increasing over time as you gain from your investments over time. And that's what we see here. Now, this is one of the main summary tables in the report that you've seen. So I wanted to take a little bit of time to explain what these different numbers are and what they mean on a deeper level. Before going into each one of these, we'll just focus on the top part here. And one important thing to know and to keep in mind is that we have a discount rate that we use for financials. So that's why you have two columns here. We have an undiscounted total and a discounted total at 3%. And what that means, why we do that, why we use a discount rate, this is standard for any kind of project investment. You'll have a discount rate, and it's to capture the fact that there's an opportunity cost to investing that money. You could have invested that money somewhere else. So there's a cost to that we want to capture. There's also the effect of people tend to rather have money now than at a later date. So there's a preference for having savings or returns earlier on. So those two effects are what's captured in this discount rate. And it's a more conservative approach to this type of plan than an undiscounted approach, because as you remember here, a lot of our savings, a lot of the positive from the roadmap happens further down the line. By using a discount rate, we're lowering that benefit to have that, to capture that effect that we would rather have, that we could have used that money for other investments, for instance. So you'll notice here, total investment, capital investment for the undiscounted column is at $3.2 billion. For the discounted one, when we're looking at investments further in time to get a lower value when we discount them, so that's 2.4. And then when we look at energy savings and maintenance costs, we're at 3 billion in undiscounted and 1.5 in discounted. So this one gets reduced much further for the discounted rate. And then we'll get to the other parts of the financials later, but the main thing here is we have, before looking at things like funding from the IRA, we have $2.4 billion in capital investments over that whole time horizon and $1.5 billion in energy savings and operation and maintenance costs in the discounted 3% discount rate. Now, one of the really important things that's happened during this project, that's happened last year, is the Inflation Reduction Act. So this represents hundreds of billions of dollars that go to things that are included in the climate action plan. So things like heat pumps, retrofits, renewable electricity, lots of funding became available last year for these different parts of the plan. So what we've done, and what's kind of interesting too, is that this is the first, to our knowledge, analysis of the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act on a municipal climate action plan. So we've went back to the financials. We looked at the different categories of the Inflation Reduction Act. We looked at what would be applied for this roadmap for Ames, looked at the different categories. So you have the different categories here, like new buildings, retrofits, battery storage, solar, and EVs. Looked at the investments every year, the amount of these things like EVs that people are purchasing every year, and what does that funding actually represent for Ames. And it's a pretty big amount. If you look at it over the whole time span, that's $770 million that it saves on the plan. So very significant number. And here you'll see a lot of it is grouped earlier on in the timeline, and this is because this is timed with those investments that we saw earlier that happened earlier on. One of the big ones here is in green is home retrofits, but you also have commercial retrofits in the other categories. So this is a big help in funding for the roadmap. And if we look at the summary effect of that, here in blue we have capital expenditures, and then we have all our savings below, and in this orange-red color, we have that IRA funding impact on the plan, and we end up with a net cost, a net present value, or net cost of $300 million over that time span until 2050 to realize the plan. And to give that number some perspective, if you look at the GDP for Ames for 2021, that's around $7.5 billion. So on an annual amount, that's about 0.15% of the GDP of the city. If we go back to our financial summary table, here we have the IRA impact added into here. So undiscounted is that number that we saw, 770 million. If you discount that, then it's 600 million. And if we look at the net cost here, we end up at $300 million for the plan. Now, if we look at the financials at a little bit more detailed level, so action by action, if you remember our wedge diagram from earlier, each one of these colors is a different action represented in one of these categories. And in the report, you have this, this is part of really the big summary table of the financials for each action. And just honing in on two of these as examples of what these numbers mean. For each one here, so if we start with large-scale renewable electricity generation, we have the amount of emissions it reduces over the whole time span. So here we have 5,000 kilotons. What's the proportion compared to every other action? So this one is quite significant compared to others at 21%. And what's the estimated cost over time here, around 800 million, and the marginal abatement cost. So for each ton that you reduce, how many dollars does that represent? So this is $155 here. And what's interesting and useful about this table is you can start looking at and comparing different actions. So here, if we look at retrofitting homes, it has a lower cumulative emissions reduction, represents 5% of the total reduction, costs around $600 million, and the cost per ton is 562. So here you can see that the cost per ton is lower for this action versus this one. In a kind of compact graphical representation of this, you have figure 30 in the report. This is marginal abatement cost curves. So you have tons of CO2, dollars per ton of CO2 on the y-axis, and then the amount of emissions reduced on the x-axis. And the main thing to look out for here is the ones on the left are the lowest cost for the most emissions reductions, and the ones on the right show the highest cost here. So you'll see, for example, things that relate to transportation tend to have a lower cost. So electrifying vehicles, increasing walking and cycling. And the highest cost one here, we have retrofits, but then the highest cost one is heat pumps. And this is explained by the fact that electricity, the price of electricity is relatively high compared to natural gas currently in Ames. And currently electricity still has emissions associated with it. So when you invest in a heat pump, there's that upfront capital cost. you're switching to electricity that, if you look at it without cleaning the electricity first, it still has emissions associated with it, and the electricity that you're using is relatively more expensive than natural gas. So that's why that one comes out higher. So we're kind of trying to capture all those dynamics in one graph to be able to compare different aspects of this. Now for the implementation strategy, it's a little bit different than the actions we've just seen. So we've looked at the modeled actions so far. We had the 30 or so modeled actions. We had our 6 big groups of big moves, and those are community-wide. So those aren't city-specific actions. Those aren't actions that the city of Ames is entirely responsible for paying for. That's just the whole city, the whole community as a whole, what needs to be done. And it shows the physical change that's required for the community to reach GHG reduction targets. And it's a very high-level strategic roadmap. Now what we're getting into is the implementation strategy. So this is City of Ames specific in that it lists and recommends things that the City of Ames, the administration of the city, should start in the next 3 years, needs to start in the next 3 years in order to meet its targets. And it shows more concrete, specific, granular initiatives to support the roadmap. One very key thing, this came up last time when we had our meeting in November, but I think it's important to spend a bit of time on this, is the importance of incremental progress. So if you look on the right here, and if you look at these big goals that are far out into the future, it could be scary and paralyzing, and you're looking at these big goals without a clear plan of actually how to achieve them. So something like retrofitting all buildings is quite the achievement. It's far out. It seems scary, but if you focus on incremental steps, which is what the implementation strategy is doing here, you'll take steps towards that goal. And taking those steps, you build momentum, you learn, you adapt, and that's the way forward, is with those incremental steps, it's building that momentum. So here we have examples that are in the implementation strategy of a pilot retrofit project focused on older homes. So that's in that retrofit category, but it's a smaller incremental step towards that goal. And this was a recommendation in the staff report that we saw together in November. Then we have other steps in the same vein, like creating a publicly available repository of suggested contractors for retrofits in Ames. So things that support citizens, that help that momentum, that help get tipping points into making these big changes happen.
And Eric, if I just may jump in quickly too with this, is to also say this is where, in looking at the ladder on the left, this is where the specificity and the real strength and commitment and wonderful ideas of the people of Ames have been built into the plan, itself. Is that we can give you the further rungs, you know what I mean, as climate action planners, but really it's been community support and the staff support and the council support that's helped us figure out what those incremental steps will look like and what's appropriate for your town.
Thank you. So getting into the implementation strategy, what we'll do now is go big move by big move and look at the recommendations. So for building retrofits programs, for heat pumps, we're looking at things like loans and financial incentives, repository of vendors and installers, sometimes things like supporting citizens with information in these things goes a long way. Contractor training, making sure there's enough trained workers for heat pump installation, and resident feedback. So to see what are the current pain points for somebody who wants to install a heat pump, hearing from the community and seeing what needs to be done there. For retrofits, here we have the pilot retrofit program for focusing on older homes, and you'll notice any implementation measures in here that have this kind of golden color to them are things that were in the staff report. that we've highlighted here and that are included in the implementation strategy. The second one here is partnering with retrofit service companies. Then we have retrofitting municipal buildings. In the plan, we have this by 2030. Energy use disclosure for large buildings. So seeing how much some of these really large buildings, large energy consumers are using energy in the community, and partnering with a community loan provider. So financing becomes a very important component of low carbon roadmap. We've seen before that kind of spike of capital expenditures at first that kind of flattens out, and then you get into your savings. So any help with getting that capital necessary for those investments in the beginning of the process is it goes a long way. So as an example for partnering with a community loan provider, there's this organization. This is a nonprofit organization, Neighborhood Finance Association. You might know of this one. It's currently available in Des Moines and Cedar Rapids. This could be an interesting partnership to explore. They offer energy improvement loans, $10,000 zero interest loans, and forgivable loans for home improvement. So very low interest rate or no interest rate loans to get those upgrades and to get through that kind of capital investment heavy part of the roadmap and get to those savings quicker. So that's one example. And here we have, we talked about the Inflation Reduction Act before, but here specifically looking at building electrification. So things like heat pumps, appliances, and retrofit type of stuff. We have that you could get up to $14,000 of tax rebate to offset those costs, and has some equity built in. So low-income households will get 100% of this amount, and then depending on the income, moderate income households will get a lower proportion of this amount. Now looking at renewable energy generation, for renewable generation, we have 50 megawatts of renewable generation by 2025 through power purchasing agreements. So there's already work being done on this, and this came out as one of the top recommendations in the staff report, is to, not specifically the 50 megawatts, but to increase renewable energy generation. Also, the idea of exploring Ames generating its own electricity, so not necessarily through power purchasing agreements, and public education. So understanding, helping the community understand what this means for rates and the dynamics that are there and what this implies for them. Then for rooftop solar, we have things like a solar group buy program. So this is where you have an organization that coordinates members of the community that are interested in solar but might not know how to get started or don't have all the information they need. This organizes them into a solar group buy program, and also they get special rates, lower rates by being part of this program and having bulk purchases of solar. We also have incentives for solar ready, so for new buildings, incentives to have them ready to have solar panels installed on them. Also financial incentives for building owners who add rooftop solar to their existing buildings, and the non-for-profit loan provider partnership would also help here. And for the solar group buy program, there's this organization that you might know, that's the Midwest Renewable Energy Association. So they've recently done, I think it was last year with Polk County, a very successful solar group buy program, which we think would be beneficial for Ames to explore and to possibly provide to the community. For net zero new construction, one of the recommendations in the staff report was new zoning code requirements and tax incentives for new net zero buildings, and also that all new so another recommendation is that all new municipal buildings starting in 2025 are net zero ready. Also providing builder training in net zero and passive house to make sure the local workforce has this knowledge and this ability. And energy use disclosure for large new buildings. and going ahead to reducing vehicle emissions. The IRA provides a tax credit of $7,500 for new electric vehicles, and also $4,000 credit for used electric vehicles, which is a new market that's emerging as these first wave of electric vehicles are getting older and more affordable. Affordability of electric vehicles is also underway, something that started as more of something for higher income households is becoming more and more attainable, and projections are showing that too for new EVs in the future. Also having EV infrastructure policies for new buildings, municipal policy for new vehicle purchases to be electric vehicles, and to support Cyride with their decarbonization plan, which I think have just announced that they're new electric buses and already had a plan for electrifying their bus fleet that went out into 2050. And then for active transportation and transit use, working with ISU to introduce a bike share program, improving active transportation infrastructure, partnering with Cyride for the possibility of offering bus passes 6 category for reducing waste emissions, implementing an organized garbage collection system, educating residents on composting and waste reduction, and implementing an alternative to the waste to energy plant to be able to use less natural gas. And we'll stop there and we'll go to questions and discussion.
Yeah, thanks everyone for your attention for all of that, but we're looking forward to the discussion and answering the questions you have.
Do you want to go back to the beginning of the slideshow and just maybe go slide by slide and see if council has any questions on the different slides? And while you're doing that, any general questions to start with? No. No, we won't take any public input tonight. There's no action being taken tonight. We're going to encourage people to email council or, or send I think Deb's going to talk about that towards the end too, in terms of how we can get feedback. And then when we have a future council meeting, decisions to be made, we'll certainly solicit feedback at that time. All right, questions? Any questions on this slide? Next slide. Questions? I'm curious that on this slide you show by 2028 that natural gas goes completely away. How do you accomplish that?
Yeah, so that's one of our actions. I guess 2 things. One is we're progressively phasing out natural gas with electrification, but there's still some left over when we get to 2030, which was one of our big reduction goals. So the leftover natural gas that's not phased out yet is replaced with renewable natural gas.
So this model assumes that within 5 years, every household, every apartment, every commercial building, everything in Iowa State will no longer use natural gas. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. In the scenario to achieve the reduction by 2030, the ISU is replaced with electric boilers, and for the building sector using natural gas, it's progressively electrified. And then we still use a little bit of gas because it's not completely phased out, but it's renewable natural gas.
So how realistic is that to implement that?
I would say with renewable natural gas, the risk factor there is the availability and the supply of it, and unknown price premium in a world where more and more people will want to have it with a limited supply. That's why we recommend using it as a tool for this type of purpose where you're transitioning from natural gas to electrification, but you want to get to net zero quicker. You're using up the remaining natural gas, you're replacing it with renewable natural gas instead of, let's say, not transitioning, not reducing that natural gas use, and then just switching it all to renewable natural gas. There would be a very, very big risk there for availability, I would think.
Don, can we ask you to follow up on this? I don't know what renewable natural gas is. Could you explain what that is? And then I'd like to follow up on the mayor's question. From what you're seeing in the industry, how viable is it that in 5 years we will have phased out natural gas?
All right, well, let me address the first question. So renewable natural gas is basically, the best way to look at it is pulling the methane off of landfill gas or off of landfill sites. That's considered renewable natural gas. It's basically processed clean. Our own wastewater treatment plant does that with the poop that we process, and they create methane, and then they're putting that into generators. So that is the most common way of making it. It is difficult to find a lot of it. As we're going through this, I'm trying to think where I would potentially get that much to continue to run the power plant and continue to burn municipal solid waste, RDF. From the second standpoint, electric has basically three options. To have it done in 5 years will be a difficult task, but the three options would be to continue to burn natural gas and then switch to biogas or renewable natural gas. And we're seeing right now in the market, if natural gas is at $4, renewable natural gas is somewhere in the neighborhood of about $12. So you're seeing 3 to even 4 times as expensive in cost. So one alternative is switch to renewable natural gas. Option 2, and I don't think we could even have it built in time, would be to switch to an energy only or a RDF only type boiler. It's going to take probably more years than 5 years even to get it permitted, designed, permitted, built, and operating. The third would be we continue to reduce the amount of RDF that is brought into the plant, that is consumed, and theoretically you could stop burning RDF completely in 5 years. That would be another theoretic way to stop burning that much natural gas. But that again is an extreme decision.
Well, this is not just for our plant. This is for the entire community. So that means Alliance is going to be providing RNG. And we've talked before about just the impact on those who may be under-resourced. You're 3 to 4 times the cost of natural gas could have a profound impact on those who can't afford it, who are living paycheck to paycheck. And so back to the consultant, what research have you done to verify the availability of renewable natural gas in our area? And can Alliant provide adequate gas within 5 years to meet our power plant as well as our entire community's needs?
Yes, we did look into that. You could have enough supply if you do what's also included here, which is aggressive phasing out of natural gas use, so that by reducing that amount, then the supply you need is less and less. If you are talking about replacing current natural gas use with renewable natural gas, I think that would be a very risky thing to do in terms of availability.
So I guess I'm just trying to tease out, in order to accomplish these objectives, and also this all plays into your financial models and everything else and the savings, et cetera, I'm just trying to make sure that if we talk about the 4 and previous conversations, and that is making sure that the assumptions are achievable. And so this also means that if we're going to all go to heat pumps in 5 years' time, can our electric grid handle everyone converting to electric heat pumps in 5 years?
So that type of a study has not been completed yet. That is something that we definitely have to look. A couple of things on heat pumps, though. A heat pump is actually more efficient than an air conditioner. So our energy consumption in the summer would actually go down, which is a good thing. Heat pumps then would be used to replace natural gas furnaces for heating. So the energy requirements in the winter would actually go up. We would still want to look at it. We could become a winter peaking utility, which would actually be quite unique for this part of the country. We believe that the infrastructure is there, and you have to factor in electric vehicle charging and other uses of electricity that will continue to drive it up. But heat pumps alone should be not an overdue burden because it's more efficient in the summer, which is when our peak system is being used. But we would want to look at it in the winter and just see how much load increases that would cause.
And Eric, in reading through your report, it's my understanding that no costs have been included for upgrades to the electric infrastructure throughout our city in terms of substations, transmissions lines, et cetera. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's accurate. It's also, yeah, that's something that comes up. And what we do for financials is we compare, if you remember, the business's planned scenario. So we always have a reference scenario as our starting point. And then we look at the difference in costs or savings from that reference scenario over time with our low carbon. So for increases in transmission lines and such, we're already seeing very increased adoption of electric vehicles. We're already seeing an increase in electrification. So even in our reference scenario, you would have to consider significant upgrades. In both scenarios, you would. So that's why we're not showing that here. It's something that will need to be done in either case.
That's a pretty significant variable in all this. Can you give us any kind of help in terms of how to quantify that piece?
I think the next plan for the utility, if I'm not wrong, is to complete integrated resource plan, which would dive into those specifics and will be a key step forward to understanding all of those dynamics.
Okay, but that puts a big asterisk next to this price because it's the price plus the unknown of the upgrades required for the utilities. Am I saying that correctly?
So in the reference scenario, you'll have very significant also requirements for upgrades. Just in the future, with the adoption of EVs, you'll have necessary upgrades. With the adoption of solar panels, you'll have necessary upgrades. So it's not just in the low carbon scenario, but in any scenario in the future, you will have those costs.
And how about the electric, going to electric boilers? This is mentioned in the cap and also discussed in terms, I believe that's probably to reduce the natural gas. What is that cost been factored into this $3.2 billion?
Was that for the electric boilers at ISU?
No. This is for our electric boilers. City of Ames. We have 2 gas-fired boilers.
Oh, right. Here we have them replaced with RNG at first, and then we have the cost of adding in renewable electricity generation to replace them. So they are included.
I apologize. Could you go back on the natural gas? So we have control, I suppose, to a degree over the type of gas that the city uses. But to the mayor's point, how would we have any influence over what residential, commercial, and industrial usage of natural gas is?
Right. So this is showing the pathway to achieve the target for the community. This is not showing the influence that the city would have on that. This is for the whole community. That's why we're showing. We had that slide that showed the low carbon actions and the implications for that, and then the implementation strategy is when we get into the responsibility of the city. On both sides.
But I apologize, we can get there later, but from your perspective, are there strategies that cities can use to impact the use of natural gas in non-governmental settings?
Yeah, if I can, or sorry, go ahead, Eric, and then I can follow up.
Sure, I was just going to point to the very large amount of funding that's available now through the Inflation Reduction Act as a huge incentive for building owners to electrify. So that could be something that could be supported by the city to just reach that tipping point. So that funding is already there and already exists.
Okay.
And further to that, often it's, to answer the question is how can the city essentially influence the other members, in the city itself, in the community, looking at the community-wide picture. Other cities have formed lots of formal partnerships, too, with other interested parties who are wanting to sign on to the climate action plan itself and take on the sort of sections that they would be that they have direct control, essentially over. And partnerships with local government often do unlock forms of funding, where the city then could be promoting to the funding that's available, as Eric mentioned, in the RA.
So again, when we have carrots and sticks, and so you're suggesting that this would be a strategy of carrots.
Could be strategy of carrots is one way of looking at it, and also perhaps the city as a quarterback, on a football team.
Okay.
Bronwyn, do you have something you want to add?
Well, yeah, I was just going to share some thoughts, and it kind of relates to this too, in the sense that our responsibility will be to also be a conduit, in terms of the small steps they mentioned first, like making a directory of service providers or something like that. That coupled with rebates or other types of incentives are going to, I imagine, play a large chunk in how we do this. And a lot of that is, hopefully funding we can get through other sources too. And then, in terms of electrical load, though Don mentioned that in the summer, we're actually better off with heat pumps than we are air conditioners. I would add that it's all happening all at once. So we can't really just look at one element without thinking about all the others too. And in my mind, the addition and encouraging of rooftop solar will matter in how much our grid needs to change too. But also how people can be saving money in the long term. A lot of these are big upfront costs, but over time, they're going to lead to lower energy costs for folks who adopt them. So those were just kind of my thoughts about how it's all sort of it all interplays. So having more rooftop solar will help with the burden of increased electrical demand. And those things have to happen at the same time for it to work really well. Anyway.
I'm just a point of reference is that I have a geothermal heat pump system in my house. I use more electricity in the summer than I do in the fall. In the winter. And my bills are significantly higher. And I get my statement now. I'm on Alliant Energy. You still haven't got me electric from Ames, but that's your responsibility. So anyway, we just happen to be in Alliance territory, and so monthly I get this, or quarterly I get this. Your house is not energy efficient at all, and here how you compare to these other things. And I have what we're talking about putting in, in houses. And so that's why my skepticism, my concern is that, when you say that this is going to save us money, I don't have a huge home, but I've never paid so much money to heat and cool my house because of electric bill, essentially. So I'm just concerned about the impact it's going to have. I think I brought this up when we were doing the, Baker Latimer, making sure that we are providing a system that is going to help keep people's energy and utility uses down. I know what the theory is. I understand all that. Believe me, I went through all the numbers before I invested the huge sum of money in the system. It just hasn't demonstrated itself to be cost effective. So the point is that I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. I'm just saying let's make sure we understand what's going on. But I've actually had the reverse. I use more electricity in the summer than in the winter. Anyway.
I have a random question. On this page, it shows the role of jet fuel. And could you speak to that issue? We've seen an increase in the use of our airport, and we generally think that that's a good thing. So
It's not for the climate a good thing.
But so what should we do? Should we try to reduce the use of our airport, or should we be encouraging the use of our airport?
Probably a drop in the bucket.
Yeah, oh, go ahead. Yeah, it could be a good thing for some things, but it's definitely produces lots of emissions. So any reductions of the use of the airport in the climate plans would reduce reductions. For airports, that's so again, this is the community-wide view. We're looking at the geographic boundary of the city. So we have the airport, we have the emissions there. Obviously, there's limited control on that aspect, but things like reducing travel definitely help there, and things like renewable fuels could help there.
Okay.
I said,
Another sort of that perspective of looking at this too could be that, again, as Eric mentioned, looking at the community view, right? So this is sort of, the geographic boundary, not 100% of what we're looking at here is within the city's control, but when we're looking at the implementation plan, it's one way to think about it is it's an opportunity to, you could have an objective to get as many rebates for as many people who live in Ames, as possible, right, to benefit sort of from the transition. And so there's two ways, I guess, of looking at it. That bigger picture view that we're talking about here is understanding the entire role of the entire team, for example, in the city, and then specifically to what the city can maximize its efforts, onto, which ends up having knock-on effects, right? So when one sort of sector leads and shows possibility, it also helps others to come along, sort of as well, and helps build momentum.
just one more. I just have one more question on this slide. And that is, can you explain the drop in the grid electricity? What is that? Does that mean we're using less grid electricity, or there's something happening on the grid? And if there is something happening on the grid, maybe Don, you could comment on that as also on this slide, because it's a pretty significant drop.
So here, there's a few things happening. One of the biggest impacts here is we've modeled that change to the waste to energy plant, that where you need to, it kind of locks you into burning a lot of natural gas to deal with waste. By upgrading that and removing that need, you see a big drop in the amount of natural gas that's used to produce electricity. Here, that's included in grid electricity. So the emissions associated with the electricity goes down. The electricity is much cleaner.
So what I'm hearing you say is that the emissions from burning our waste is less than what we could purchase or get from the grid, which I thought was working more towards solar and wind. Is that correct?
So grid electricity here, maybe we could have had a name that's more accurate, but this includes locally generated electricity. This is all the electricity supply. That's why it's included in here.
So that brings me to another question. I was not on council 10 years ago when the vote was made to convert from coal to natural gas, although I was very supportive of that. And we spent, and Don, you can help me with the numbers. I don't know that number, but the cost of conversion of our power plant from coal to natural gas, I watched it happen from my office. It was an amazing transformation. Is this proposal contemplate that we phase out the capacity to burn natural gas for electricity in Ames?
So the structure that the utility is working under, as we proceed moving more to a green environment, we still have to maintain all of the generating equipment that we have. We're not planning on shutting anything down. We need it for capacity for the MISO market. We have to have that capability. What would ideally happen if we found a different way to remove municipal solid waste? If we move to a municipal solid waste boiler that only burned municipal solid waste, that would produce 5 megawatts of energy. To put it in perspective, we're currently generating about 45 megawatts with the plant today. So let's say we move the waste to its standalone boiler. We then would buy more from the grid, and we would build more wind and more solar, and that's where we would get our energy predominantly. So that's where our energy would come from. It would be green, it would be renewable, whether it's MISO, what's called MISO energy, or wind and solar that we own. Those units then would be there for emergency, for price protection. If prices went sky high in the grid, we could start those, and to meet MISO capacity. So they're there, but they would be run significantly less in the future than they are today, with the energy coming from my term grid energy, which is not including the power plant, but in the terminology on the screen, grid energy is all of it, ours and the cities. So does that make sense? We're transitioning our energy equipment that's providing that would all be wind, solar, and MISO. So it wouldn't be necessarily natural gas fired. We'd have to keep the units, but they're only run a significantly less amount of time.
Okay, thank you.
And would you still convert our natural gas fired boilers to electric?
No, it serves no useful purpose to do that.
Yeah, that makes, I mean, if you're just going to hardly ever use the boilers, it's just there for capacity. Why spend the money on, yeah, okay. All right. All right. I'll go to the next.
Move to the next slide.
Certainly.
Maybe here. Any questions on the wedge diagram slide?
So you show on the right-hand side, minus 94% over 2021. I thought the base year we were comparing to was 2018. Am I incorrect there?
Yeah, I have to remember if our target was 2021 or 2018, but the base year in the model is 2018.
Okay, thank you. And then maybe Mary could comment on this in terms of, Iowa State just switched or is switching from coal to natural gas. Can you share with us what you're hearing from them in terms of, in order to accomplish this, what their thoughts are on this? I know they have their own climate action plan too.
Yes, correct. So we wanted to look at the first 50% reduction and accomplishing what we could at this time. That was accomplished or will be accomplished very soon with the switchover from our last coal boiler. We have been coal-free on campus since February 28th. We do have consultants on board now to look at where the next 50%, where those opportunities are. And we expect a little later this spring, maybe early summer, to get the reports back from the consultants. So at this moment, we're looking into it, but we don't have those final considerations related to the next 50%.
Thank you. Any other questions or any questions on this one? All right, next slide. Questions on this one?
Yeah, I have a question, Eric, on this. So was this slide based on a model developed specifically for Ames, or is somehow this model an industry standard that you adjusted for Ames? It's a fascinating chart.
Yeah, so good question. The model we use is an industry standard that we adjust for Ames. The financial data we use is industry standard, and then custom data from the project team in Ames or other staff in Ames for different sectors. So industry standard model customized to Ames.
Okay, thank you.
So in this one, is the assumption that cash is being paid for all the improvements? There's no financing at all on this?
That's correct. In this graph, there's no financing. We've seen different graphs in the more financial focused presentation where we have this kind of curved out more with financing, but this one is more the non-finance version. or is the non-finance version.
Yeah, I think this is really an important
Yeah.
factor because it assumes that everyone's got cash to do their $60,000 upgrade or whatever it is to their homes. And I think one of the graphs that you have in the cap, it shows if you include some financing costs, and it's really peaking at 2050. And I think your text says it will take till 2070 to pay off all the improvements. But those, when I total up, estimate the cost that you show on your graph to 2050, that's like $3.2 billion by itself and doesn't include the trailing 20 years. So I'm just trying to understand what is the total actual cost, because the people are going to have to borrow some money. I mean, I've been trying to understand the IRA, I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act and what's available. And I'm presuming you guys did a huge deep dive into it, but I don't know that everything that we're talking about is going to all of a sudden just, flow through a faucet right to Ames and pay for everything. So can you comment on that? And 'cause I think it's really, would you agree it'd be a more accurate representation to show that businesses are going to finance, residences are going to finance, even the city's going to have to finance some of their improvements. And so it would seem to be a little an incomplete picture to not include financing costs, especially in our interest rate market that we have today.
Oh, that's correct. That's why we include both in the report. So we have this version that is just year by year expenditures, and then we have the amortized graph, which we don't have in this presentation, but is included in the report that shows the with financing what that looks like. And definitely funding and financing will be key parts to the plan.
Do you remember, Eric, off the top of your head, what interest rate you used for the financing model?
Oh, that's a good question. Yul, I don't know if you know this one off the top of your head.
I'm guessing it's too low. I think that's the only thing that I can say.
Well, that'd be my guess also, because no one knows what the future is. And the other thing is, we're looking at 25, 28 years in the future. What factor of inflation has been integrated into this? Because these project costs, I mean, I think, and the reason I'm asking the question, I'm not trying to tear the port apart. It's just more or less, if we're going to adopt a plan, it just seems it's got to be really accurate, well thought out, and we can basically defend it, and it actually has a true, what we believe are fairly accurate cost projections, and we need to identify what are the financing assumptions that are being made, so that in 5 years, oops, we were too low, or we were too high, or inflation was much higher, so it has a little more, because future councils and future mayors and staff will be working off of this as well too, and I think it's better to have that kind of, those kind of marker points essentially. But I don't know if it's possible to pull up that one chart, but I just thought, wow, that's a pretty remarkable, example of showing we're talking about well north of $3.2 billion. In my opinion, you're probably getting, you're probably talking $5 or $6 billion, I think. By the time you have all the interest costs.
Just to jump in on that. So we don't include inflation in this analysis, and that's very standard because inflation can be so distortionary to the numbers that you actually lose touch of what you're trying to evaluate. So most people with this kind of work don't include inflation. And in terms of the overall totals, if it is 3.2 or more billion, I think the interesting finding for Ames this case was that it still is not a huge percentage of total GDP, if we call it that. In Ames, it's still a relatively small amount. So it's, I think that was one piece that we were somewhat reassured by, not to set aside the challenging of financing all of this, doing all of this in the timeline, I think is the really big risk. But in terms of the overall dollar value, it wasn't as high as we usually see. We usually see 5 to 10% of GDP in terms of capital expenditures.
Well,
so it's,
I think your footnote
that's hopeful, I think.
Well, I think your GDP you talk about in the report is for Iowa. It's not for Ames. It's It's for the entire state.
Yeah, so, yeah, there's two numbers in there. There's a proportionate allocation of GDP for Iowa to Ames in order to get a sense of what that might be. And then we also track the total expenditures in the reference scenario, which is, this is the incremental change against the reference scenario. So we also get a good sense of how much is spent on all the stuff that is impacted by this plan. So that also gives you another good reference point.
Can I just ask, this is actually, I think, the next slide, but we're talking about these numbers, and I'm not even really clear whether on the next slide where we have the 3.2 billion undiscounted low carbon scenario and the low carbon scenario 3% discount rate at 2.4 billion, whether that 2.4 billion is the same 2.4 billion we were talking about before, or whether the 2.4 billion we were talking about previously is now the 3.2 billion on this chart. Can you clarify that? Did that make sense?
So I think so. Let's go through that. Yeah. So the 2.4 billion is the number that we've seen in the financial presentation as like the total cost in terms of previous chart. Okay, we don't. So is this? I don't see a number here for total expenditure, but this would be what we've presented before. Is the discounted? That's the industry standard, is to discount the totals. And this is just to give the undiscounted, which could be useful also. I don't know if that answers your questions, but these are the numbers that we've seen in previous presentations.
Okay, that does. I think the staff report called out the change from the 2.4 billion to the 3.2 billion, which is what was confusing me, because it sounded like the cost had gone up, but it's actually just a different way of reflecting the cost.
That's correct.
Okay. And so the 2.4 billion is what we've been talking about, and that is the 3% discounted total.
That's correct.
Okay.
So for someone paying for projects, are they going to pay 2.4 or 3.2? What's the
Someone
what's
paying
the
for-
2.2.
what's the out of pocket going to be?
So normally a business would use a 7% or 8% discount rate. The 3% discount rate is the social discount rate, which is used for economic analysis for a community, as is the case of the analysis before you. If you were to do the projects and you were a business, do our project, which is encompassed within this plan, and you're a business, you would be looking at a much higher discount rate than 3%.
So back to my question, how much is going to be paid out of pocket for these projects? It's 3.2 billion, correct?
Yeah, that's hard cash,
Correct.
undiscounted.
Without, and that also does not include inflation, and it does not include any interest for financing anything.
That's right. Yeah. On the opposite side, it doesn't include the Inflation Reduction Act contribution.
No, I understand.
or
You have
savings to the road. Yeah.
you have identified that down lower. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
I guess I would just like to add a point to the discussion. This is not a question, but it's an observation that I don't see that we have any guarantee that the Inflation Reduction Act is going to last for any length of time if we have a change in leadership in the federal government. So I'm not sure how much we can count on that beyond a very near term in our calculations.
Well, I would just add,
Yeah.
I would agree with you, Gloria. The other thing is that when this kind of money is available, you can bet there's going to be a lot of people that are going to be interested in accessing the money as well too. And I think it's broken down. Actually, if you go to that slide, you have, it's kind of like the, not a pie chart. There you go. Back one. There you go. There's just different programs where it can be used also. So for housing and commercial buildings, there's 48 billion. And so many people across the nation will probably be wanting to access it. And so a lot of unknowns to your point, Gloria, I think too.
Could we go back to
Yep.
the slide showing this?
Can I add one thing? Sorry, my apologies to interrupt. I just wanted to add one more thing to that point, is to say, yeah, that's an important observation. And also, while this is the biggest one, to see in American history, in the length of time we've been doing this, though, too, new programs continue to come online to fund these types of things too, which has been an interesting observation over about 15 years or so.
Could we go to the summary of financial results? Yeah, that one. So this has been very helpful. The mayor's raised some interesting points that the 3.2, you have a big asterisk next to that because of some other things not included. I have two questions on this slide. How do you determine what the allocation of the Inflation Reduction Act would be for Ames? How could we possibly know that? That's a pretty big presumption, isn't it?
So we're looking at the potential for the Inflation Reduction Act based on the different components of it. So we looked at heat pumps. People installing new heat pumps could apply for the funding. So what does that mean for the potential of this fund? EVs, there's a potential there for the funding. So we're looking at potential for IRA funding programs here. And there are risks, as mentioned before, in terms of how long this will last for also that are important to consider.
So, and that's very helpful. So that 770 is just individuals applying for rebates for EVs and other environmental measures. Is that correct? It's not, these don't include like grants and large scale capital projects.
That's right. We included everything that's here in these categories. So new buildings, commercial retrofits, energy efficient home, battery storage, rooftop solar EVs, but there's also more that we haven't included. We were a bit conservative in that sense. There's funding for electric buses, for example. We haven't included that. There's funding for utilities that could play a big part for Ames. We haven't included that. So there's even more in the IRA that could potentially help out with the roadmap.
So my concern is similar to the mayor's, that in this model, it seems very presumptive that we would receive $770 million of this pot. So if all the rest of the country is also making application for EVs and retrofits, then would that exceed the amount of even the IRA in terms of what it's allocated for this?
There's a risk there. We didn't look at the risk for that. So that's why we've included all the numbers here. So you can see the cost with it and without it. And then, of course, there's risks with anything, and there's risks to the IRA, such as how long it'll last and the supply of funding.
My point's very simple. We are a very small community in the scale of this country, and it just seems like a very big presumption that a city of roughly 70,000 people would receive federal dollars of $770 million. Does that seem like a very big, that's a lot of money per person, right?
Well, $400 billion is a lot of money per person also. It's a pretty significant amount of funding that came through last year for the whole country.
But one thing to be aware of is that this is not going to be distributed in a nice, even fashion. When you look at other ways large federal programs are distributed, Iowa is one of the lowest states in terms of recipients for government programs. And there's lots of examples of this. So I just think we have to be really careful. My recommendation would be to have a range in that IRA funding. It just seems like a very large portion, and so much of that is this model is based on a $770 million flow of funds. And then I want to take you down to the bottom number, average investment per person year of employment. Could you explain? That's 43,000. What does that exactly mean?
Right, so how we calculate employment gains in the model is with any capital investment. So let's say you build a large scale solar utility that'll create jobs. So for any capital investment, we have an estimate of how many jobs that would produce. So this is just a metric combining a few things here where we're looking at in the capital investments that we have and using those estimates of employment. What's the average investment per person year of employment, 1 year of employment for one person?
I am so sorry I didn't understand that. What I thought it was getting at was trying to tease out what the cost for the average resident of Ames would be for the climate action plan. But that doesn't sound like what you're describing. Is there a way of trying to quantify on a per capita basis what the cost of this plan would be?
Yep, there's a way to do that.
That seems like an important number for us to know.
One of the difficult challenges behind that, though, is that it also depends on what is being funded, you know what I mean, and by whom. And so that would be part of the picture, I think, as well.
That's my point exactly. So if you're presuming that of the 3.2 billion, that 770 million is coming from the federal trough, then that's going to skew the number. So I'm willing to just go with your number, even if we presume what I think is an optimistic number and assuming it's 3.2 and not a higher number. Just with your numbers, what do you calculate this would be for our residents?
So just a couple more contextual pieces on IRA. I think the way we positioned this is that it is a maximum possible number, and most of the numbers actually don't include IRA, the financial numbers in the report. But the good news for Ames is that there is no other community in Canada, or in no other community, city or otherwise in the US that actually has quantified IRA and its impacts for the city. So Ames is the very first. And that means that you are the most ready of any jurisdiction, municipal jurisdiction in the US, to take advantage of these funds. So that makes the possibility somewhat more possible. But I think the idea of a range is still a good concept. In terms of allocating on a per capita basis, it is also tricky because you have to figure out who's actually going to pay for what. So you could take the total and divide it by the number of people in names, but that would be misleading because businesses will make some of those investments, individuals will make some of those investments. And so you really have to piece that out to get a good per capita number, which we certainly can do. But some decision needs to be made in order to do that.
And that's really what I would ask as the consultant. I agree with everything you're saying, that the cost would not be borne equally by all of the people. That's certainly true. But I don't know how to calculate that number. And when we last met in November, I asked a question of whether you knew of a city in North America that had engaged on a climate action plan that was anywhere near the scope of Ames. And have you been able to determine or find a city that has anywhere near this price tag for our residents?
I think most communities that are taking on ambitious climate action plans have very similar price tags, of which there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of municipalities doing that at this very moment.
I mean, you don't have, I'm not trying to put you on the spot. If you could email me later with just one that has adopted a climate action plan. We're a city of 70,000, half are college students that are looking at a conservatively $3.2 billion plan. I want to be candid with you with respect to the sticker shock, at least to this council member, and the impacts this would have on the other obligations we have to the community and on property taxes, on utility rates. I can't conceptually understand how we would do that. And so it would be helpful to know that if there are other cities out there that are leading the way and charting this path, it would be helpful to know where those cities are.
In terms of similar size ones that we've worked with that I know are also on this path are Lakewood, Ohio, Tacoma, Bellingham. But I think the framing is also important, just to make sure that you are understanding it. So that's the 3.2 billion is a capital investment that is spread over 27 years. And that much of those expenditures or investments will happen in one form or another. This is sort of pushing them towards low carbon options because people are still going to buy cars and people are still going to build houses and do renovations and so on. So you're really pushing those renovations, and it's not municipality that is paying for those. It's the municipality is just, I think the metaphor of quarterback is a really good one. It's trying to make sure those investments are going in a direction that reduces emissions. And that could include programming or information or regulations or whatever strategies, many of which are identified in the implementation plan. But I don't think it would make any sense in any conditions for Ames as a municipality to pay that $3.2 billion. That's a community investment, which as well generates returns. So the investment is an opportunity, not just a pain in terms of how it's actually framed. So you're making an investment to generate returns, some of which are financial, some of which are non-financial. And that's, I think, the paradigm that many of the municipalities are working under. This is an economic development opportunity. It's not an increased tax opportunity. It's how do we make sure we're future-proofing our community and also taking advantage of the energy transition that's underway. So that's really the paradigm that I think most communities are approaching this major challenge with.
Okay, thank you.
I think it's also worth noting that we said when we were setting those goals that this was aspirational. And I think we can look at the IRA funding in the same way. It's aspirational to say we're going to get 770 million. But if we don't aspire to it, we certainly aren't going to get it. And, you have to apply if you want that money. And so it doesn't make any sense to me to make a lower estimate on what's possible, but we have to be conscious of the fact that the likelihood that we'll get that is probably not great. But it's possible, so why not? It's aspirational.
So whoever's controlling the slides, can you go back just a couple of slides just for a second, and then I'm going to go back to your financial slide. A couple more. One more. There you go. So, I'm sorry. There you go. So this chart that you're showing, does that correlate to 3 slides later?
That's correct. Yep.
Okay. So what I was looking at was trying to draw in on my iPad is trying to superimpose a line showing what you show on the IRA savings by category and trying to determine what the difference is. See where I'm going with this? If you had a line, because your vertical scale has changed. It's 20,000. I'm sorry, it's 20 million to 60 million. But the scale is different on the previous slide where you go up to your top line is 237. So there's a gap, there's a difference between what the IRA will put in. So if you go back just for a second, I think you'll follow what I'm saying. If you drew a line that showed what the actual IRA, if we got the $770 million, it's going to be a much lower line, much lower than a net annual cost. So somehow we're going to have to, somehow individuals, businesses, cities, Iowa State have to make up the difference between the IRA amount and the investment per year. And if you're showing energy cost savings are very, very small to start with. So there's really a huge, I'm just trying to figure out how in the world can you finance something in the over $1 billion or more in the course of a few years. See where I'm going with this? I'm trying to make sure, get my mind wrapped around how in the world and where's the capital going to come from? Because you're asking individuals, you're asking apartment owners, you're asking city. See, I'm just trying to get my mind wrapped around how there's a huge difference between the two. I think it might be helpful maybe in the final report just to have like you have shown the net annual cost, maybe just to have another line just showing the potential IRA contribution theoretically, because then this is kind of showing long term, yes, you're going to get some energy savings, but it's going to be delayed. Meanwhile, people are paying money on paying those loans back and having to come up with the money to accomplish that in order to achieve the graph you just looked at a few minutes ago.
I think you've just nailed the essential challenge of this effort in every element of society, which is we need to do this now, we need the capital now, but the savings are amortized over time. And that is, I think, the essential case for financing. That's how as a society, we've financed energy infrastructure, we've financed all sorts of infrastructure using exactly that approach. I don't think we've figured out how to finance this transition yet. Although green banks are definitely getting a lot of success in the US. So that's one strategy that is being used to deal with exactly this problem. Green bonds is another strategy that's being used. But there's a lot of experiments and innovation to address exactly the problem that you've identified.
Okay, any other questions on this graph? Otherwise, I think we've gone back and forth a little bit. You had actually, I think, moved forward to, yeah, those charts. Any more questions on these charts? If not, we can go on to the IRA. I call it the pie chart. It's kind of a weird pie, but that's how a pie would look if I would make it. Any questions on this? Okay, no questions. We've already talked about this one. Any questions on this?
Could you clarify just again the average price? I must have missed this for a retrofit for the average residential home.
I don't have that number here, but I believe it's around $50,000 US for about 50% reduction in energy. That would be
Ours was higher.
$2021.
I think our numbers was higher when we did, but we'll have to check locally what that means. Yeah.
And then can you also, yes, you got an email today just about going to net zero housing. What have you found? I think that I thought I had read that it was, minimal amount of money investment to do a net zero house, but maybe that was totally incorrect. But what are you seeing in terms of getting houses to be net zero ready?
So for all net zero new buildings, we have different price premiums in the model for different categories, and they range from 1% to 2% price premium up to 12%, I think is the range, depending on the building type. So there's a range there. It's much cheaper to reduce energy use in a building that's not built yet. You have much more options than for example, a retrofitting a building, an existing building. So it's relatively cheaper to do that way.
Thank you. Well, as you can appreciate, maybe it's the same way or worse in where you guys are living, but house prices have just skyrocketed. In fact, I heard someone comment today how much per year it's gone up, and it just kind of made my head spin, in the last couple of years. I'm just trying to think, in terms of, we already struggle in Ames with housing prices being, going up quite a bit. And so to add 10%, 15%, to a house cost, if it was required by zoning, could have a pretty profound impact on it's already a challenging market for building houses. So anyway. All right,
Yeah.
next.
And
Go ahead.
yep. I was just going to say with that, you have to, I guess when if you were to make that decision, you have to keep in mind the energy savings potential. And then that gets us back to the whole financing piece that we've been discussing.
Next slide. Questions? Okay, keep going. I think we already saw this slide. I think it's just kind of copy before, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's correct. So,
And then the next slide, we also looked at it before. So I guess you're going into your, can you kind of talk about these just for a quick second? And any questions on this one?
I guess I had a question more for our city team than for the consultants. And that is, when we look at this and we've got the retrofit of municipal buildings on there, and we also saw on one of the slides implementation of heat pumps, for example, in municipal buildings. Have we assessed which projects we have coming up that are opportunity projects? For example, I think about how long it's taking us to repair the HVAC issues here in City Hall. And it seems to me that that's possibly an opportunity because we haven't yet spent the money on that. And is it an opportunity to instead pivot to do something else that could fit with the plan? That's the only thing that comes to my mind right now. But have we looked at the kinds of things that might be heading into obsolescence? Or
No, that's one of the next steps we would have to do. We'd have to hire a consultant to do an evaluation of all of our buildings. That's what we're suggesting, and what it'll take to get there. Challenge there is about financing,
Mhm.
Is it an essential corporate purpose? Is it a general corporate purpose? What will the state legislature do in terms of financing those? So it'll be interesting because we don't have cash for those kind of investments, so we will have to borrow money. We'll have to deal with all these issues of borrowing money. How do we do it? Legality, which may be different than other states than they're used to, but we can check on all that. But our in terms of the municipal buildings, the next step is to do a total evaluation of the existing buildings, what it would take to meet these retrofits, and then come up with a financial plan or a legal plan to do it. Part of the capital improvements plan.
And that would take into consideration the kinds of capital improvements that we might typically be planning to make, but shift them.
Yes. We don't have any others besides the auditorium. I don't think we have any major ones besides carpet repair and painting. But it's not that we don't have, and the animal control shelter is one that we've talked about. But we didn't have any major capital improvements planned for buildings, but we will plan it with this consulting report.
Now, the new buildings are different.
Yeah.
As we look at
Mhm.
building at the plaza, the indoor aquatic center, the animal shelter, those opportunities to be more efficient.
And we've asked them to be more efficient, also be net zero
Net
ready.
zero ready.
I really commend you for this slide. I think it's just very, very helpful. And I just want to draw just a couple of points. Your line 2.5, retrofits a home. the cost, the marginal abatement cost in comparison to other ones is just mind numbing. You know, you're going from actually, minus 64 and minus 101 to 562. The amount of investment for a proportional total reduction of 5%. And then I don't know if that includes, I don't think so, because 2 slides later it shows home retrofit 562, and that says heat pumps and residential retrofits 1,359. So I don't know if the true cost is actually 18 or 1,900. Because if you're going to retrofit a home, wouldn't you be doing both a heat pump and insulation and windows? Or can you comment on that, Eric?
Yeah, that's one tricky thing with the MAC curves. You don't want to add up these numbers here. They're not additive. They're taken both individually on this curve. So to have like the equivalent for retrofits and heat pumps, you'd have to look at those two together and make a calculation.
Okay.
But those are the highest costs. That's correct. This is what this is showing.
Again, I'm not saying not to do it, but it's just more or less very high investment, very low return.
Yeah, so underlying this, I think we talked a little bit before about different links and integration of a lot of different things happening here. And underlying this, you look at heat pumps, you look at $1,359, and you're probably thinking, why would we ever do this compared to other things? But there's a reason why it's here. There's a reason why every one of these is here. For heat pumps is that you need to stop burning fossil fuels to stop emissions, and you need to electrify equipment. So this is part of that. Even though there's a high cost to it, it's still, you could call it an enabler, because once you've electrified the heat pumps and you have that low electricity use for heating, then you switch your electricity to 100% clean electricity, then you see the true value of that. But taken separately here, you miss a bit of that story, but it's still a useful way to kind of compare every action here.
And to the Mayor's point, could you clarify again what is included in the retrofit of homes, just so we're on the same page?
Yeah, so 50% reduction in energy use. So this is not a detailed building by building level retrofit study, but in general, for that type of energy use, you're looking at things like air sealing. Just air sealing can accomplish a lot in different cases, and you're looking at improved insulation, windows and doors. Those would be the main ways you'd look at reducing energy use.
Okay, thanks.
Just one more clarification on this marginal abatement cost curve. This does not include IRA funding. So if you did take IRA funding, all of these costs would, or the ones that are relevant rather, would actually go down on a per ton basis.
Yeah, heat pumps would be half of this. I think we looked at that one just as a quick example with IRA. So still expensive, but depending on which one, it makes a significant impact for each action for sure.
Any other questions on this slide? All right, let's go to the implementation strategy. Questions, comments? The only question I had, Eric, was just, it says start in the next 3 years, yet all of our graphs are being shown like things happening in 2023. Can you kind of help us understand that?
Do you mean the graph is showing things happening before in the next 3 years? Is that?
Yeah, actually, I hate to have you keep going back. You're probably your fingers are gonna wear out, but you showing the bar graph showing the millions of dollars being invested. In 2022, it shows hardly anything, but 2023, it's showing $117 million being spent this year. And by 2026, we would have spent $400 million. So I was just curious what your thoughts
Yep.
were on that.
I understand the question. Yeah. So yeah, believe it or not, we started this project in 2021. So that was 2023 was the future when we modeled this back then. But I think the main idea here is that there's urgency. There's urgency. There was urgency in 2021 when we were looking at these actions, and now it's only become more urgent with time. Start in the next 3 years. Obviously, if it's possible to start faster than that, then definitely that'll help out with achieving the plan.
Okay, thank you. Next slide. No questions. Next slide. Questions? So the loans you're talking about is the neighborhood financial, whatever it is you're talking about, or what you say loans and financial incentives? Is the city's not becoming a bank, so to speak? Is that correct? It's more or less people going out and borrowing money from different lenders, whatever.
That's correct. In this instance, we gave an example of Neighborhood Finance Association. I didn't know about them before this project, but looking into the options, this seems like a local one, not available currently in Ames, but available in Des Moines and Cedar Rapids. They're nonprofit and they give very low interest or even zero interest loans for energy upgrades because they understand this whole financing piece that we've been talking about and the necessity for that. So partnering with organizations like this could go a bit can make a big difference in helping solve that financing piece. And where does the capital come from?
Yeah, I had never heard this before either, but it's intriguing. Where's the money coming from? Because no one's going to loan out money at 0% interest, and it's trying to make a profit on it. Is that coming from local government? Is that coming from federal government, or where is that coming from?
That's a good question, and I think good question to ask.
Is that coming from SSG?
Have the answer to that.
How about SSG? Are you guys going to go ahead and do that? Loan it for 0% or do your forgivable loan? That's part of your services, isn't it? No comment?
No comment. I'll stay away from that one.
All right. Deb or Mary, have you have any experience with this or looked into this at all? It wasn't in the report, so I would have looked it up if it was, but kind of intriguing. Okay, next slide. So on the overall incentive, it says max consumer rebate. Let's just assume that you mentioned $50,000 or $60,000 for a retrofit. So that is identifying that someone who, let's say I apply for it, the most I would be able to get is $14,000. Is that correct? That's correct. Yeah, it's to help support people who are under-resourced retrofits and kind of nudge them in the direction of energy retrofits, right? A lot of people are renovating their homes and things like that. But if you get funding for things like triple pane windows instead of double pane, then you can make that happen. So it's really not to pay for the entire thing, but to help push people along to the more energy savings options. And do you know, could this be used by someone who's building a new home and get rebates that way? Is the IRA available? There is IRA funding for new homes. Okay. Also, I don't have that slide. That's okay. That's right. Good.
We have an answer to the Neighborhood Finance Corporation. And it's a partnership involving a variety of banks and other loaning institutions, as well as municipal and county funding.
So it is local funding then. Okay, thank you.
So as long as we're on a slide that says retrofits on it, as I've been listening to all this, I've been thinking about the unintended consequences of the retrofitting process. We've been talking about the benefits of retrofits, but if everybody starts to retrofit their homes at the same time, aren't we also contributing to greenhouse gases in various demolition processes and waste that's produced by removing whatever was there before the retrofit occurred. And maybe that's not something that's a big enough impact that it figures into any calculations, but it seems like it's something that we should be keeping in mind, especially since we have been discussing where municipal waste goes and how we handle the waste process.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and it's not included here. We didn't include like consumption-based emissions or embodied emissions, so even things like EVs, purchasing EVs. Yeah, definitely a good point. I forgot what I was going to say. I had something else to add there. Yeah, sorry, I'm blanking on that one.
All right, next slide.
Oh, I remembered, sorry. We promote the way we model things, and our philosophy is improve, reduce, switch, yeah, that's it. Or reduce, improve, switch, sorry. So basically, the number one thing you want to do is reduce activities that contribute to GHGs and energy use. And then you want to improve efficiency of things, and then you would look at things like switching out technologies. So definitely more on reducing consumption first before prioritizing that over things like retrofits, if that makes sense. I think that's good kind of framework or lens to make decisions under in general when it comes to this type of stuff.
Questions on this one? As if you didn't know, I'm kind of a number geek. Back to that slide for a second. I looked on the map. It's about 5 acres for a megawatt. Is that right, Don? For solar?
We're looking at ground solar is between 5 and 7 megawatts per, or 5 to 7 acres per megawatt. That's correct.
Anyway, I just did the math. In your report, you say we need to get 700 megawatts of solar as part of the overall plan, and that was over 3,500 acres of land, which is like 5 square miles, which is 20% of the land area of Ames for solar. And I'm just thinking back to our fringe plan conversation and taking farm ground or other land. I know there's some areas you're exploring where we can't build on it, which is I think a very good potential use for it. But anyway, it's just takes a lot of land for solar.
We're looking at, through the request for proposal process, we are looking at a few rooftop solars, and we think we can get about 2 megawatts using some of the city buildings for that. And then we have a closed landfill here in Ames, and we're looking at a project that could add about 4 megawatts to the closed landfill. So those are 2 where we're not using land that would be used for a better purpose.
And I think that Iowa State's actually exploring alternative crop growth underneath solar panels as well too, which is kind of innovative. So I mean, maybe there's things in the future we can take advantage of in terms of understanding what they're doing.
Yeah, we're participating with them at our SunSmart project. We're looking at possibly growing kale or other things like that. We've got bee pollinators that are going in, and then, as I mentioned before, we're looking at sheep as our mowing way to mow it. She said goats. Goats climb on equipment.
Sheep don't. Are we looking at the opportunities to put solar over parking lots that the city may own?
It's something that we've talked about. The infrastructure to do that and make it safe so that if cars hit it and things like that is a little bit more difficult. We did offer some of the floodplain land that exists in Ames where you can't really build any buildings on that. most of the developers were not too excited about building solar panels in floodplain, even if they built them 8-10 feet off the ground. So we didn't get a lot of good response on that land. But parking lots would be another thing I've talked about, covering Jack Trice, maybe the fund, but didn't get a lot of interest in that either.
I think they're calling it Sci-Town.
All right, next slide. Keep going.
Do we know where the legislature is on any of those zoning code issues that they were discussing or the stormwater issues? I lost track of it.
Personally, I don't know where stormwater is at. I believe that the building code limitations, I think, died this year. I'm not sure. I mean, I kind of been out of touch for a week or so in terms of what's going on, but and things change, so stay tuned. It could get attached to something else in the future, but that always is a possibility too.
So I have a question here. So we've talked about the fact that cities' hands are tied with respect to not having requirements that are a higher standard than the state building codes. Is there a way that we can use zoning codes as a way of circumventing that? And
Yeah, I think so. But we have to meet with Mark, but that's what Kelly would tell you. Building code requires everybody to build. Zoning, I don't think is a right necessarily. So it would be like a contract rezoning. You don't have to do it, but the council doesn't have to allow something to be rezoned. So that may be an avenue we could pursue with Mark. That's different than having a prescriptive a requirement of everyone they build a building to meet certain standards.
it seems pretty similar to me, and I wonder if the legislature will allow cities to do this.
I wouldn't want to speculate what the state legislature would do if they saw us doing it a certain way they didn't agree with. I wouldn't be surprised if they did. If they disagreed, they would change it. But I think there's an avenue we can explore as it exists today.
And
But Mark can speak more to that.
And Eric, could you again come back to the issue? I'm confused because I think we've heard different things. So if, let's just say we play this out and say, for all the new construction we're going to do, we're going to create a zoning code, and it will require any new construction to have net zero buildings. Are you suggesting that that would have no cost for would that add additional cost to the construction? I'm not talking about over time, but just upfront cost. Would that be zero, or would there be some cost per house?
So if for zoning code requirements, that was taken from the recommendation from staff report. So I don't know if we can speak to that.
I can speak to
Well,
other
that's-
municipalities. If that's helpful.
Sure. Please, you'll.
So the way other municipalities have done that is to do incremental improvements, like a phased performance requirement, so that the building industry can adapt with over 5 years or something like that. Although the building industry is adapting pretty quickly now, but that has really reduced the upfront cost, so that net zero just becomes standard, and then everything is sort of built around that, and there's no longer an incremental cost. So that step code sort of approach has been the way that a number of municipalities have addressed it using their zoning requirements. And they often call it like green development standard is the lingo that's used when zoning is the mechanism for requiring building performance.
So I certainly will spot you that once it's implemented, then it's not an incremental point at that stage. Let me make this clear. If we have two side-by-side developments, one that has the net zero and one that does not, is there a way in which we can compare the cost, the financial impact per house? Is that number known?
So Tim, in some of our discussions with the home builders association, they'll say there's at least an additional $60,000 on the top to do a net zero new home construction. And then and asking us as we get further down the road in this to clarify what we mean by net zero and net zero ready. Does that mean site placement on the property? Does that mean the type of carpet and the type of paint for the interior? Or are we just looking at windows, doors, insulation, roof, that type of thing?
And the email I received from Justin indicates $60,000 to $85,000 to every home. And so those are real numbers that people who have to choose between, are we going to live in Huxley, who's already eating our lunch in terms of new construction, or Ankeny, that's going to make our houses that much more expensive. And so is anyone with the team, is that consistent with what you're seeing? Or are the home builders trying to scare us?
It's different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. I guess as a planner, like I'm thinking of it through a planning lens though too, is that what's the long-term cost though too of a home that has a certain type of energy use requirements, knowing that in general energy costs always go up. Kind of thing too, right? So there's other sorts of dimensions or considerations, I guess, that come to mind when I think about cost and what the cost of a new home would be. Sort of like the upfront capital cost of buying, of course, being one that we're discussing right now, but what's the long-term maintenance look like to continue to heat that home as well? Or would you be able to, with increased energy prices in the future, and or depending on the type of hookup it has, will that type of energy or that source be available in the future at a price that is affordable? Sorry, Eric, I didn't mean to cut you off, but please jump in.
No, that's good. I don't have anything. That's good.
So one other consideration there is that 60 to 85K, if that includes, if it's a net zero home, typically it would include a solar install on the house. But if the grid or the electricity source is already decarbonized, from an emissions perspective, that solar install may not be required, which can significantly reduce that capital cost. So there's a lot of nuances to what that might mean.
Yeah, sort of better said than what I was, you know what I mean, essentially saying, but are we making it harder for folks to, you know, do you want to have to retrofit in the future or start with something that doesn't need to be retrofit to begin with?
Well, I think to Tim's point, getting back to the conversation earlier tonight, and that is, if someone's going to borrow an additional, let's say $50,000 to buy a net zero home, and I think your numbers showed annual savings of about less than $2,000 a year in terms of energy savings. You know, if I were buying that home, I'd be doing the number crunching and saying, hey, is the energy savings going to offset the cost for the additional mortgage cost? And if not, then I have to decide if I want to pay that or, move someplace else. And I think that disconnected from this, your study, and just as a point of reference, we're struggling with not having very many housing starts in Ames, but we have people that want to live in our community. And so as we're looking at the fact that inflation is just knocking the socks off of the prices of housing, and then to consider an additional, I'll just use 50,000, maybe it's less, maybe it's more. On top of that, if that was required by zoning, that could be a real deal breaker and may just kill, future housing. And then the council's going to have to decide what's more important, essentially. So it's a data point just for you. And again, not being in no way being critical. It's just we're thinking through these different arenas, different lenses, and trying to decide how we're going to move the needle on a variety of fronts.
Yeah, I would say we do have a lot of experience with exactly that situation. And it's always, I think it's always a difficult conversation. In most cases, I don't think that requirement has been a barrier to new construction. It seems to be that there are other factors that are greater barriers. At least I'm thinking of a number of municipalities in the greater Toronto area where we've had exactly the same conversation. But inflation is a real challenge, for sure.
Well, I think we got this point well made. I think it's getting part and parcel of the conversation, I think, going forward. So thank you for bringing it up. So let's move to the next slide. Any questions on this one? You have in the slides says net savings. Is that correct, or is that all the other ones that had net cost? Or
That's correct.
Okay.
So, and yeah, in the MAC curve too, we saw the transportation actions tend to be net savings.
And just a point of clarification on Cyride made it clear, and it's in the staff report, 17 vehicles is what they're going to be at in terms of electric vehicles out of a fleet of about 100. Does your model assume 100% electrification of transit of Cyride?
Yeah, to get to the target, you need that. Or I guess an alternative would be renewable fuels if they're available, but you need some way of making that fleet zero emissions.
Okay, thank you. Next slide. So are you willing to talk to our downtown business owners about the car-free zones?
Yeah, that's always a tricky one. I think what we're saying here is to start by assessing the possibility and the impact and looking into this more deeply. And yeah, definitely a trickier one to implement.
For those of us who have been on council for a while, we went through some just parking meter changes that this one would be a very interesting conversation. So.
Yeah, I know here where I live, with experimenting with car-free zones, it led to restaurants being able to have patios that they couldn't have, too, and sort of a different type of downtown feel. So yeah, there's lots of interesting discussion to be had around transitions related to car-free zones.
Okay.
And how do we think about people who have mobility issues for whom they're going to have to use a car? And we have these things, you have them too, called winners. How do you do these car-free zones and not end up discriminating against people who are older or people who have different mobility challenges?
Yeah, I think any action, any measure in the implementation strategy has to have inclusivity and equity component to it. I think that's essential.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right, last slide. Questions?
So I had a general question about recycling, even though I know you said that's not a piece that you typically look at. Is there a way we could look at the impact, if that is something we want to consider within a model of, because already at our facility, there's a way to recover metals and other things. How can we consider that within this model?
Yeah, great question. So in the model, we do include that kind of recycling of metals and sorting of materials. We got that data from the city. And we also, it doesn't show here, but we also have, it's waste generation and diversion are two key things that are here. And in diversion includes recycling. So the less stuff you can send to the landfill, the better. And it reduces emissions, definitely.
So that's included in the waste reduction there in this slide.
Yeah, it's not clearly, it's not on this slide, but it is included in the model.
Okay.
Diversion of waste, so recycling is included in the model, yes.
Thank you.
Have you included anything for the cost to build a whole new plant in your model?
I missed the last part of that, sorry.
Have you included in your financial model the cost to build? Because we're talking about, council saw a report here recently, and I think the lowest cost was over $100 million to build a new waste to energy facility. Is that included in your model? Because there's no under emission reductions. There's no net cost included. I was just didn't know if you included anything in your model?
Yeah, it is included in the model. I think it should show up here. I can't remember why it doesn't show up here, but the waste to energy plant, we had it at $100 million in the model coming in 2030.
Okay. All right, I think we got through all the slides. Do you have any closing comments? And then we'll turn it back over to staff.
Can I just have just a couple more, and you guys have been so patient with my questions. I really appreciate it. I'm still struggling with trying to wrap my brain around whether the climate action plan that we are looking at is going to cause taxes to increase or utility rates to rise. And there's been all this discussion that the funds for this would all come from other places. And somehow this would have no impact on our taxpayers and our utility rates. And whether it's the city staff or the consultants, is that true?
What are you asking?
So,
Yes, the finances plan, electric rates and property taxes will probably have to go up, but I think we're losing the focus here. Trying to make sure this shows that it breaks even is not the only thing. There's a benefit to the environment too. We're losing track of that. So
I'm willing to spot you on that.
well,
So,
my point is it's going to cost more. I mean, we're out there taking proposals now and it's going to cost more for wind and solar. I'm assuming you're doing it for a purpose other than trying to justify the public it's going to break even or make money. Now, like everything else, as we do with all capital improvements, we try to give you a realistic plan. So we levelize those costs as much as possible, right? It is overwhelming to try to do all in 3 years, hundreds of millions of dollars. So, and people don't want to be patient on that, but you may have to, because there is going to be a sticker shock to that. And we have people in this community who can't afford that no matter what. We'll have to come back with a chart on all these moves and these action plans, see which ones we're saying we have to pay for and which other people can pay for. But retrofit, I'm telling you, to get this done, you're going to have to subsidize those. We can go to a lot of places, we'll have to subsidize them. That's a cost to the electric utility or cost of property taxes, right? It's going to go up. You're going to invest in this. That's why you're doing it. But yes, our job is to keep that cost as little as possible in terms of incremental each year. And that's going to be a challenge. There's no doubt about it. That's why the council's saying it's aspirational. I understand that. And I'm confident as technology change, and transportation is the biggest one. You just know what's happening. I've talked to more and more people who tell me they're going to go out and buy EV, cars and chargers as soon as they get increased mileage and things like that. So things are going to change rapidly with technology too. That's going to help us. And we're going to continue to look at we're not so sold on $100 million on the waste reduction thing. We're challenging ourselves to come up with another plan. We've had some more discussions on that too. So we're fighting as much as we can to hold the costs down, but we are going to have increased costs and probably greater than if we did nothing. That's going to be. That's the kind of investment we're going to have to make. Is it reasonable? Well, that's what we'll have to talk about. You're going to have to know certain things. You're going to look at and see what's the cost to the person who buys a house. How about the people who can't afford it? You're going to have to take that all into account.
so, I mean, but we've been at this now for over a year. Do we have a sense of what the impact will be on our taxpayers and ratepayers yet?
No, because I don't believe we're going to be able to do it all. So we're going to have to give you a plan that starts out that's manageable.
I think that's the next step.
And then we'll be able to get you more information. You're going to have to help us. What level of subsidy you want? If it's a subsidy per house of $60,000, I don't believe a zero loan is going to attract people. A $15,000 loan, we're going to have to put in more money than that. So what are you prepared to pay? We can certainly quantify that, right? And we're not even sure how many people will take advantage of it. That's why a pilot program will give us a lot of information to get started on. But as we get more specific in which steps we're going to take, and there's a lot of action steps here, we'll be able to quantify that for you. And we're going to have to tell you what it's going to cost if we can even do it legally in terms of utility costs and in property tax costs, right?
But so just in fairness, I'm hearing two different things. So as a council, we the council adopted a very aggressive goal of being at 94% by 2050 and 83% by 2030. I believe that's, I'm saying this correctly. So are we going to be approaching this from an incremental approach to say, what is it that we can afford? Or are we going to say, no, we're going to do this and we don't care about the cost?
I don't,
It-
I don't speak for the council, but I don't believe, they always care about the cost, but they want to be as aggressive as possible, but they have to care about the cost. And we have legal limits on what we can even do. We couldn't possibly do all this.
Well, it's not our role to pay for everything ourselves either. So, and we've said this so many times, but I'll say it once more. It's not the city that is bearing the full cost of this. It's not our taxpayers. They will bear some cost for sure. And I want to be sensitive to that. But a lot of our role is going to be connecting people with resources and connecting people with funding that exists out there from other sources. Might be federal government, might be other grants and programs that are in existence to pay for this kind of thing. But our role is going to be building directories of people that provide services like that, perhaps building directories of grants and funding programs that are out there. And that will be the city's role. So not just funding everything ourselves as the city, but serving as a conduit for having people who are interested in doing retrofits or things like that, having them be able to more easily find the resources to be able to do that on their own. Because to do it now, it can be very challenging for a homeowner to figure out, well, gosh, who does do solar panels? Who does do heat pumps? You know, where could I get funding for that? Like right now, an individual would have to go out and learn that all on their own. And what the city can do is catalog that all. And that's where we can start help making some changes. So there are costs, yes, but there are also funding sources other than the city and other than individuals too. Not to say that our tax, we won't see any increase as individuals, and not to say that the city won't see any increase or our utilities, but it's not all going to be borne by the city. So I don't want it to be phrased in such an alarmist way, I guess.
I think the next step is we have to have a chart that shows you of all the big moves and the action steps, where we think, according to the consultants, we have to plug in our money, which is going to be those other areas. Maybe it'll allay some of your fears. And then we have to look at where we are involved and what level do you want to be involved. Let's say we're going to fund retrofitting. We're going to give incentives. How much do you want to give per home? I'm not actually going to make that decision now, but then you'll know, and we'll be able to quantify all that. And maybe we won't be able to move as fast or do all these things. I think the council's prepared for that. We just said we get started and we start doing something, right? But you've got to take into account costs and the unintended consequences. If no one can live here, everybody moves out of town because they can't afford it. I don't think that's your role as a city council either. So you're going to have to take that into account.
Well, this is all very
I
encouraging.
think the council agrees, right?
I mean, this is all very encouraging because when we first made the decision to adopt the climate action plan goals, we didn't have any price tag on any of this.
Right.
And we set the climate action goals back in December of 2021 without any sense of the price tag. And then as we've had prices come to us, I'm trying to reconcile. We have this climate action goal and we have this price. And so either we're going to stay with the climate action plan and we're going to continue to pursue that, but I don't know where this is all going to come from.
Well, I think that I appreciate the fact that council many times have said this is aspirational.
Well,
so I think what's helped me transition a little bit is this is not a CIP. This is actually a strategy. They're showing us how we could try and get there, but council's going to take a decision. How's it going to affect electric rates? To your point, Tim, that's the next step, I think. What's council willing to commit? Steve's put some money in for next year's budget to go towards maybe some initiatives, and then lay us out to business owners, to residents. I think doing investigation with this neighborhood foundations or whatever, NFA or whatever, checking in with the IRA and finding out what might be available, as Brian was saying, maybe that becomes a strategy. And then we'll get feedback from the community in terms of what is, so that's where it's aspirational. It's not like, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. We're going to do this, no matter what by 2030. I think the point is that we're going to try and get as far as we can to that point. Is my sense. But
To second that, I know you're nervous, maybe you're nervous about adopting this plan, but I think when you adopt the plan, what you're really saying, you've asked the consultants, you gave them the goal. They have now told you how you get there, right? That's if you did everything. When you adopt the plan, you're not committing to everything. They've laid out in the report that every year we have to come up and you have to approve an annual action plan. And that's where you'll start getting the expenditure and which programs you want. That's, as the mayor said, we'll be able to quantify the individual costs.
Yep.
So they give you an action plan, you're not committing to that total plan.
Well,
That's how we get there. But the action plan you approve each year will be what you give us direction on, we commit to. And each year, I think we're going to have to be able to evaluate our progress, right? How well we've done and what we want to do the next year.
And look
So
at
that's what-
unanticipated outcomes, things that are out of our control that have
Change. Yeah.
impacted,
Mhm.
or new technologies that allow us to do more things. But that's all within that annual work plan.
I would say I wanted the high targets we originally set, right? The 83% reduction by 2030 and then the net zero by 2050. But we're hearing from the consultants and from the staff team too, that those targets that we originally set really are unfeasible, right? So they've come back with this new 71% by 2030 and 94% by 2050. And while I would prefer the original ones, if I'm hearing really that those are really unfeasible, then I think we are being reasonable in having really set those targets high initially, and then now with more information, come to a place where like, okay, well, what's achievable, right? So I was a little comforted by that.
or maybe to clarify, not what is it going to take to make it achievable, essentially. That's where I was trying to drill down into zero natural gas in 5 years. I mean, gosh, that means I got to go ahead and replace my water heater.
Better get on
No, I just did. The point is,
that. Oh, no.
my point being is that everyone's got to make decisions. I think my sense is they've done their job to show what the significant amount of work it's going to take to accomplish it. Now, whether we get there or not, I think we have to go ahead and say, eventually adopt the plan. And then what are we going to do? How can we help?
That's right. Each
And
year,
then-
you're going
and
to
the-
decide what is
Mhm.
achievable.
And the CUNY is going to have to go ahead and decide what they're willing to do. And the other player here is Iowa State. Iowa State's they have a lot of buildings. They've got a lot of, power generation. I know they're committed to it. I know I'm talking to Dr. Winterstein and their head of their, I forget his name, but anyway, we met with Paul, and
Head of physical planning.
right.
Mark Cruz.
Oh, Mark too. Yeah. I'm sorry.
Anyway, the point is they're committed to working towards, their goals as well too. So I think it's more or less, it just shows there's some pretty significant changes that are required. So anyway,
So this is, just to bring this home, this is actually the evidentiary approach that was originally proposed. I made this motion in December of 2021 that we do this we evaluate these projects in terms of what is feasible. And now today, in April of 2023, we've sort of come full circle to that. And we're going to look at this as what we can afford. And I think that that's hopefully a little bit encouraging to the community that we've sort of abandoned the strength in which we haven't.
No.
No.
Well, then,
We still have that aspirational goal. But now that we have numbers, we can come up with the actions that are doable to help us keep heading toward that goal. We can still be the leaders in our community moving forward with these actions. That's not abandonment of an aspirational goal.
it is from the standpoint of what you're willing to pay for that. And that's the part that I'm really trying to tease out. We can make the
No.
aspiration to be net zero by next year. That's aspirational. The question is, what is the council, what is the community willing to pay for this in terms of higher taxes and higher utility rates?
That's the way that
if-
we go. It's like trying to get to Des Moines. We needed to know what road we were going to need to go on before we could decide how far we're going to go and how fast we're going to go. And that's what this goal has done for us, shown us how to get there. And then we'll be able to make those other determinations about investments.
And we'll be driving our EVs when we're on that road.
All right, very good. Any closing comments from consultants tonight?
Just to say thank you very much for your time and your very thoughtful, questions in this discussion. We always like it when our clients want to really dig into this. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you.
All right. Any closing comments? Deb? Yeah.
Yeah, staff.
Do you want them to hang? Do you want to? I think tonight we've exhausted the consultants. Not exhausted them, but exhausted the questions for them. But thank you. Thank you for your efforts, and we'll let staff get back in touch with you and where we go. All right.
All right.
Go ahead, Deb.
Yeah, so we still have time for additional input and feedback from the public. So starting tomorrow, we'll have the Climate Action Plan document posted on the website and give people an opportunity to provide us with input and feedback. And to do that, they can email us at the sustainability at cityofames.com. And so that's the email address we've been touting all during this project, and those emails go to Don and Mary and Susan and I. So that's where we want to collect the feedback and the input. I'm sorry, what did I say? I'm sorry. It's after 8. Sustainability at cityofames.org. And we'll also have the PowerPoint presentation from tonight on the website for people to view. And that comment period will be open until May 10th. And then we will provide that information to SSG, to council, and we'll be coming back one more time. It'll either be the end of May or that first meeting in June for the final adoption of the plan. So
May I suggest that you keep the comment period open, but the cutoff that goes back to the community or back to the consultant has a cutoff. But I think that council would like to still get feedback, and I hate to have, a May 10th cutoff, but then we're not going to meet until late May or early June.
Sure.
That's another month that we could potentially get some valuable feedback. It might not make it into the consultant's report, but at least we're still getting that, and then you're also getting that, and kind of and the reason for not, we'll take emails. We've gotten emails, from the council, but the point is going to you allows you to aggregate those and helps us understand everything at one point.
Yep. No, very, very good point. So we'll use the cutoff date of May 10th for the consultant, but then we'll continue keeping it open to collect that input for council and to be able to share
Thank
it.
you.
And I would say within the next few weeks, we'll know if we're looking at that last date in May, that last council meeting in May to bring the report forward, or if we're going to bump that to that first meeting in June. So
And what will happen at that next meeting?
yep. So we'll have all the information and the final draft or the final version of the climate action plan ready for adoption by council.
All right. Everyone understand where we're headed?
So sustainability at cityofames.org is where you want to send your input and feedback.
All right. Mary, Don, any closing comments? Susan? Thanks for all your efforts. And to those that have served on the, what do you call it? The sustainability ad hoc, supplemental, whatever it is.
Sick for sure.
Even though I appointed people, I still know the name. Anyway, thank you for all your efforts and participation. That's really important. And for those who are here, who are generally interested, thank you for coming. And we will now transition into, we have 4 communications. We need to see what we want to do with those, and then we'll go to council comments. So thank you, staff.
Thank you.
All right. We have a email from Lisa Hovis regarding amendments to the noise ordinance. And council, I'm wondering if it'd be acceptable to contact Ames Main Street and see if they would see if they could work with the parties and come to a consensus on how to resolve this versus trying to go back into the ordinance and make changes. But if that's okay with you, then maybe Steve or I could go ahead and be in contact with them and ask them to look into it. If they can come to resolution, then they would come back to us. Is that all right?
So moved.
All right.
Second.
All right. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. Next is from David Blakely and Joel Paulson regarding paid parking. And Steve, you suggested
I think you should refer to us. We made major changes in front yard parking, and I thought we took care of one of these addresses. Remember that? We grandfathered some in, so I'm not sure if this is something other than we just passed our ordinance or what. So I need to get more information from you. It's not clear to me. Maybe a staff person knows what the request is. So if you want to follow up on it, we can get your memo, see if we can help here or not.
I'd move we get a memo from staff.
Second.
those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, and the last two regarding tax abatement and increased density for single-family resident lots. Did you all get a letter from AEDC regarding, if not, you're going to be getting one?
I don't have it yet.
May I just ask that we just table these until next week? We'll bring it back because there's an email or a letter coming that kind of would tie some of this together with that too. So,
These
So-
are the letters from Kurt Friedrich.
yeah. It's just basically just deferring them for 1 week. Kind of like all bundled together into one
Okay, I
group.
move we defer to
All
a
right,
week.
thank you.
Second.
Those in favor say aye.
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 Those opposed, carried. Jeremy, would you see to it that those 3 and 4 are just carried over to 1 more week? All right, council comments. Bronwyn, we'll start with you.
No, nothing for me tonight.
All right, thank you.
Nothing tonight. Nothing for me.
Nothing tonight.
Nothing.
Nope.
All right. Well, I just think tonight's another great example of the work that staff does and it's been a lot of work, a lot of effort put in. And so I just commend them for what they're doing. And I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
Move we adjourn.
Second.
All right. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
We are adjourned. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.